Welcome, everyone. Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah.
All right. So we're going to get started. This is the Empire State Supportive Housing Initiative, or ESSHI, housing 11 different target populations. Or as I like to say, what's the secret sauce to housing these groups? So I recognize that we are the only thing standing in between you and happy hour. So we're going to try and keep this lively, interesting. No pressure, guys. You can do it.
No pressure.
Brief is key. So we will try to keep this to 90 minutes. And as I said, I think everyone should know by now, if you don't, that we're not doing our jobs, that the state has made a huge investment into supportive housing over the next 15 years, 20,000 units, so really big. We're now into second, third year in between, right? And the group that sits before us are the 8 members of the ESSHI Interagency Work Group. These are the policymakers charged with implementing this exciting new program. So today, I think many of you have probably been a part of the network's capacity building efforts over the last couple years, where we kind of focus both on the services and the capital of the ESSHI program. But today we really want to get more specifically into talking about the homeless populations and targeting of the 11 different populations. So what type of services are unique to each of these individual populations? What are some of the universal elements as well? And we also wanted to take some time today to learn about what happens once you secure a permanent award. We spent a lot of time talking about how do you get a permanent award, but what happens after you've done that? And sort of from all of these folks' point of views, what are the responsibilities of the awardees and sort of the relationship with the contracting agencies? So before I introduce the panelists and dive right in, just a few things to mention. Steve Piasecki, who's out here in the audience. Steve, raise your hand. If at any time you have a question for any of the panelists, please write it down on the index card that was provided on your chair. Steve will be walking around throughout the panel. He'll be collecting those, and then I'll ask them towards the end of the panelist presentations. And then most importantly, I just wanted to mention that I think probably everyone in this room is aware that there is an ESSHI RFP out on the street right now. So because of that, we are in the middle of a procurement process. Therefore, the panelists cannot speak or answer any questions about the specific RFP. So please don't direct questions that way. If you do, we'll have to weed them out, and they just won't be able to address it. So starting on my left, I have Rick Umholtz, who is the Director of the Bureau of Housing and Support Services with the Office of Temporary and Disability Assistance. Rick oversees the administration of several homeless programs, including the Homelessness Housing Assistance Program and the New York State Supportive Housing Program, just to mention a few. Next to him is Brett Hebner. He is the Director of the Bureau of Housing Development and Support for the New York State Office of Mental Health, where he oversees the operation and preservation of OMH's single site and scattered site beds, as well as administering all of the new RFPs. Deborah Vogel has been the Domestic Violence Program Administrator at the New York State Office for Preservation of Domestic Violence for 23 years. In addition to focusing on housing there under this role, she works on developing legislation and monitoring state and federal legislative policy on domestic violence. Matt Beck is the Director of Vulnerable Populations at the Office of Children and Family Services. Matt has worked in the field for 20 years and is currently focusing on runaway and homeless youth and young adults in foster care, and preventing sex trafficking of youth. And then to my right, Henri Williams is the Director of the Bureau of Housing for the Office of Alcoholism and Substance Abuse Services. He oversees all of the agency's permanent supportive housing initiatives and works with all of Oasis contracted housing providers. Amanda Speciale is the contract manager at the Bureau of Social Determinants of Health under the New York State Department of Health. She's been there since 2015. Many responsibilities, of which one of them is being project manager for the Medicaid redesign team supportive housing capital projects. Cindy Ravida has been the Director of Housing for the New York State Department of Health AIDS Institute for the past 8 years, where she administers all of the state's housing programs, including ESSHI, Ryan White, New York, et cetera. She's been with the AIDS Institute for over 25 years. And Alex Brooks has been a policy analyst at the New York State Office for People with Developmental Disabilities since 2009. Prior to working with OPWDD's supportive housing programs, he worked on housing counseling programs that provided assistance to first-time home buyers. So that is our esteemed panelists. Very excited to kind of dive in today to a few questions we're going to ask. The way we're going to do this is I'll ask 2 questions to the entire panel, so everyone will have a chance to answer those, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience that Steve has handed me. So the first question, and I think we'll start down here, if that's okay. ESSHI serves families and individuals who are both homeless and have one or more of 11 different disabling conditions, including disabilities that supportive housing has traditionally served, like chronic homelessness, serious mental illness, substance abuse disorder, persons living with HIV/AIDS, veterans, and youth aging out of foster care. It's also now expanded to target supportive housing for other populations, including adults or youth re-entering the community from incarceration or juvenile justice placement, victims and survivors of domestic violence, frail elderly, and now people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So of course, housing all of these different populations can be very complex and require very specific sets of services depending on the disability. Can each of you spend a few minutes talking about the populations you oversee and what services are critical for those populations to maintain housing and live successful, independent lives?
All right, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. So once again, I'm Alex Brooks from the New York State Office for People with Developmental Disabilities. We were not in the first year of ESSHI, but we were included in the second year. We have several different populations that we have got eligible under the homeless definition of ESSHI, those being young adults aging out of residential schools and people people transitioning out of institutional settings, such as developmental centers and intermediate care facilities that may have no other place to go after transitioning out. If you're familiar with OPWDD's residential request list, these might be people that fall under our Priority 1 category. We ensure that our services must be person-centered. There can't be any sort of blanket services that cover everybody. They must be directed directly towards the person and what their needs are. If you have someone that is new to the OPWDD service system who is qualified eligible population under the ESSHI program, we have front doors at each of our regional offices. There are satellite offices across the state that can assist with the assessment process to find out what services a person may need and help them get authorized for services under our Medicaid waiver. Through the ESSHI program, we have a variety of services outside of our Medicaid waiver that we've seen a lot of providers utilize to help run their programs. A big one, particularly in non-urban centers, is transportation, particularly in the non-work hours and on the weekends. Housing navigation is another service through the New York Alliance for Inclusion and Innovation. It's a training program for staff members to assist people with housing stability, benefit coordination, financial education, and any housing crisis resolution they may be experiencing. And additionally, another staffing position is that we've seen some people utilize a concierge service, which is just a staff member on site who's available for someone who may require supportive services or may not, just to be there for any resources and community linkages they may need. Some other things about OPWDD services and ESSHI programs, they are not allowed to be certified or licensed at all. They must be non-certified units. Under our main capital supportive housing program, there is some certification allowed, but through ESSHI, no certification is allowed. Thank you.
That's good.
I don't have to follow you. My microphone doesn't work. My microphone doesn't work. Of course.
Just for the record, I thought that song was pretty appropriate in the background. Come together.
Hi, I'm Cindy Ravida. I'm with the AIDS Institute. I'm the director of housing. You're a tough one to follow. So mine's very simple. Our main goal with housing people with HIV is to, if they're not virally suppressed, is to get them virally suppressed. There's 36,000 people in New York State with HIV that are not virally suppressed. So some of you, if you're in the HIV/AIDS industry, you would know that Governor Cuomo came out with the Ending the Epidemic plan, to end the epidemic by the end of 2020. At the end of 2014, 113,000 people were living with diagnosed HIV in New York State. 1/3 of these individuals are not virally suppressed. So part of our ESSHI housing program is to work with clients to keep them retained in care and to collect viral loads every 6 months. So that's a requirement of our program. They must collect viral load, easier said than done in some cases because, as you know, supportive housing providers don't always have that connection to be able to get individuals viral load. But it's really to teach individuals about how important it is to get to viral suppression. So you're not infecting others for people that are HIV negative, and so you can remain healthy. And we realize that stable housing is a very big part of remaining in healthcare. And I wish I had some more statistics from the AIDS Institute, but I do know that we have about 20 funded housing programs right now, and we're at 87% viral load suppression, so that's pretty good. And we do realize that, like I said, housing is a very important part of keeping people virally suppressed. So New York State has seen a decline in new HIV diagnosis overall from 4,600 in 2009 to 3,400 in 2014. Our main goal is to access, linkage, and retention of care. They're key priorities to work towards by the end of 2020. So we have a lot of work to do, but we're making a lot of strides. And the ESSHI program we have 2 operational facilities right now, one in Staten Island and one in Albany, that are at complete capacity.
Great. Good afternoon, everybody. As McLean said, my name is Amanda Speciale, and I'm the ESSHI project manager for the Department of Health. Within the department, we work with the frail elderly senior population as well as the population with the Medicaid redesign team designation. Now, to be considered under the frail elderly definition, persons need to be 55 or older, enrolled in Medicaid, and require assistance with one or more activities of daily living or instrumental activities of daily living. When we talk about the Medicaid redesign team designation, the person needs to be both homeless and meet the definition of individuals who are enrolled in Medicaid or have used Medicaid in the last 12 months and meet at least one of the following. I am going to go through a menu of things, but just remember this is in the RFP, but they have to be enrolled in a health home, state hospital, and or state voluntary community residence and or community residence single room occupancy resident, or skilled nursing facility, enrolled in a health and recovery plan or special needs plan. You can also qualify as a high Medicaid utilizer by the number of emergency department visits and inpatient stays, or being within the top 20% of Medicaid recipients' spending relative to the county of fiscal responsibility. The supportive services of a project are crucial, and for the frail elderly senior population and the MRT designation, many of them that I mention as critical fall under both. A few examples of the services that can be provided are life skills training, which are very person-oriented, tenancy support services, which could be financial assistance, landlord relations, eviction prevention, advocacy and linkages to community resources, social and wellness activities, which is especially important for our senior population as they face an additional obstacle of dealing with the isolation and depression that face many of them, and recertification assistance and benefits. It's really important to remember that health-related services will be taken care of through their individual health care plan. So the managed long-term care plans could assist with transportation to medical appointments, medication pre-pours, varying levels of home care, depending on what that individual needs, health home, and programs of all-inclusive care for the elderly, which could provide an example of adult day, primary care, meals, and even therapy, speech or occupational, if that need is necessary. Thank you.
I get to go now? Yeah. All right, Henri from Oasis. So, given I come from Oasis, of course our population are substance use disorder. We target primarily single adults and families. we really feel good about families. Families is an arena we've gotten into in the last, I'd say, 10 years. And housing families, in our minds, allows us to impact on the cycle of poverty and homelessness and begin to change that script. The other thing I just want to emphasize, a little different from some of my partners, is with our single housing, we don't double up. And the reason is we think of this as permanent supportive housing. At some point, the person taking over the apartment unit, and when you have roommates, it's a little bit difficult to do that. The other thing that we think has made a tremendous impact on our population is Housing First. So Housing First, as you may have heard, is housing with no preconditions. And up until Housing First, I'm doing something wrong? Oh, okay. Wow. So up until Housing First, okay, all right. So up until Housing First, does it keep ringing?
Yes.
Yeah. All right, I'll wait. Go? Okay. So up until Housing First, for the most part, our population. Ooh, I'm going to move this back. How's that? Okay. Does that work? No?
No.
How's that?
A little closer.
Closer, 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 closer? That's better? Okay.
Good.
All right. So up until Housing First, for the most part, you know, we've dealt with folks who were completing treatment or were actively involved in treatment, which is great, but it left out a huge portion of the population. If you think about stages of change and harm reduction, why not have someone anchor with housing and then begin to address the other issues? Of course, with Housing First, what is really important is the dedicated supportive services, the things that you're going to wrap around the individual to make this work. So in our arena, we look at this as developing what we call personalized, individualized service planning. We have case management services. We definitely want to look at the family unit as an entire unit, not just focusing on the primary individual that got into the housing. We also, I've heard this in other presentations, because of the HCBS rules, Home and Community-Based Services, which Oasis is a part of, our housing has to be integrated. So there can't be any signs, labels, or any indications that there's a disability group living there. Within that, individuals have to have leases, they have to have their own keys, they have rights to privacy. Pretty much they look like just you and me, you know, living in an apartment. The other thing we want to make sure of is referrals. We want to make sure we make referrals to physical and behavioral health. As part of us being in the MRT program, we started to build in referrals to the health homes. And I've seen a lot of success with that. With our Medicaid population, I think we're up to about 65% of our folks have really gotten involved and are part of the health homes. The other thing we think is really important is the community neighborhood resources and services. You know, I was talking to someone recently about one of their projects from a prior round, and as they start describing the project, I'm like, wow, that's not going to work. And, you know, part of it is, you know, we had a food desert, if you know what I mean by that. There was issues of transportation, and so ideally, we want to look at the package. And the package means, you know, as you move forward and do this, have you looked at access to schools? Are you looking at supermarkets? You know, the ability to get public transportation, because people don't have cars. Are there recreational outlets? Are there social supports in the neighborhood that someone can take advantage of? Things like the YMCA Girls Club when you talk about children. With the introduction of families, we had to really start thinking about emergency planning, you know, a little bit different than single adults. in the event of, let's say, with Housing First, that individual decides to move from a pre-contemplator to, I want to go into an action or do some recovery, we need to have a plan for those children, you know, if that person is going to be absent from the home for a period of time. So these are things we want you to think about if you are going to come forward and do family housing. We have also done, oh, I'm running over. I'm sorry. All right, I'm almost done. All right. So one of the other things we're doing with the family housing in New York City is we're piloting this Strengthening Families grant and literally looking at, given the homelessness, the circumstances, how can we help parents become better parents and manage better? And I think we're in the second round of the pilot, going very well. Hopefully, it'll go well enough where we can look at expanding this and making this part and parcel of family housing. I think I'm done, right? Yeah. Okay.
We'll come back. We'll come
We'll
back.
come back.
We'll do it,
Okay.
yeah.
So hopefully I can make up on some time. The New York State Office of Children and Family Services, we just want to be really clear. We don't hold any contracts when it comes to the ESSHI, but what our job is we kind of review anything that's proposed from the programmatic standpoint of youth and young adults who have aged out of foster care, or any young adults who may have been in a runaway and homeless youth shelter or transitional independent living program. And typically what we review on is what kind of services are going to be provided for those young adults. So typically we want to see trauma-informed practices that are embedded with youth development principles and practices. We want to see some normalcy for these youth, so youth that leave foster care oftentimes have not had a lot of normative experiences. So from a programmatic and supportive lens, we want to make sure that these young adults are being able to take opportunities to explore new and exciting things. Some independent living skills. We want young adults to be prepared for work, college, or life. Seems pretty global and broad, it is. But what we've seen over the years is that as kids age out of foster care, they're lacking some of those skills. So we want to make sure that any of these programs that are providing services for young adults that are aging out of foster care are helping to provide some of those programmatic aspects. We feel that that's the key. That's the only way we're going to end up getting to really permanent housing as opposed to supportive housing. So that's really from our office's standpoint what we do in this initiative and this collaborative partnership. So I think I'll help on the time and I'll move it forward.
Okay.
I feel bad.
I was going to borrow some of Alex's minutes, but Henri used them all up. So. I'm Deborah Vogel with the State Office for the Prevention of Domestic Violence. Am I too close or too far? Okay. The real priority for serving domestic violence victims or survivors is safety and security. Before looking at services, one thing applicants need to keep in mind is safe access to a secure building, and that begins with the physical design before you're really even looking at services. Any place that a victim or her children could be at risk is something that you would need to look at in your design, both inside and outside a building. So that would be entrances, walkways, children's playgrounds. If your project would have unsecured public access somewhere in the building, such as offices or community space, then these safety features would have to apply to provide secure access to the housing quarters, to the apartments. There should be on-site security. 24/7 is preferable, but if there's a project that may not be able to finance that in their budget, then there needs to be really clear and strict security protocols for off hours so that survivors know where to turn if they feel they're at risk in their living quarters. Records should be kept in a secure, locked place. That's to make sure that only appropriate personnel have access to the confidential information about survivors. Safety planning is another really critical piece for victims. It's critical to reduce risk survivors need to have a plan in place for both where they're living, but where they're going to be traveling in the community. There's a workshop going on right now about safety planning for domestic violence victims, so it's very critical. Some of the things that I'm mentioning are really well known to any of you who are domestic violence service providers. For any of you present that may be considering a project where you're going to include some DV survivors in your apartments, you really need to be partnering with the domestic violence service provider in your community. There's at least one licensed provider in every county in New York State. There's several in some of the boroughs. So you need to have working relationships with them, and you're going to need to demonstrate that in an ESSHI application. There's going to be an upload feature so that you can document that you have had conversations with a DV provider. It's really important that you're working with, if you're not a provider yourself, that you're working with folks who have that expertise. In terms of services, trauma-informed services are essential that recognize not just physical abuse, but psychological and emotional abuse, sexual abuse, and financial abuse. And also that recognize just the ongoing and long-term fear and social isolation that a lot of victims have experienced. It's a competition out there. So that really translates into medical and behavioral health services for PTSD, head trauma, head injury, chronic health issues, anxiety and depression, and substance abuse, some of the same issues that are shared by the other populations that other folks are working with. Another really important service that's needed for domestic violence victims is legal advocacy. That could be with the police or with the courts, either criminal court, most likely family court, to make sure that victims are able to access orders of protection or have them enforced, which is a continuing challenge for survivors. The other piece to legal advocacy is civil legal matters. Divorce in many cases for survivors with children, challenging custody and visitation issues, child support, sometimes CPS, the Child Protective Services, and also sometimes immigration issues, which I think other populations face. In the case of survivors, they have the added complication that often abusers will take their papers, so that undocumented women are at risk. And then finally, financial issues are really difficult. I think probably for all populations, there are many folks who don't have very good budgeting skills, but in addition to that, for domestic violence survivors, a program may also need to help them with recovering from identity theft and credit damage that's been caused by the abuser. Also, they may have a poor rental history particularly because of evictions, and that's often caused because of all the police calls caused by the police being called when the abuser is committing abuse or when the abuser has created property damage. So sometimes you'll need to work with survivors in order to work through just keeping up with their rent, because they really haven't had a lot of experience with that and are stressed around that. So that is a factor that needs to be taken into account. And also, trauma-informed services or programming for children is also really helpful for folks who are going to be working with domestic violence victims, and parenting education.
Hi, Brett Hebner from OMH, and before I get into the services, I just want to take a moment. OMH, as you know, is the procurement agency.
Hey, Brett, could you talk closer?
Oh, really? I was trying not to. Sorry. So even though OMH is the lead procurement agency, I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that all of us are kind of the agency representatives here, but Moira Tashin, who is the Associate Commissioner at OMH, is our chair, and she's here in the front row, so if, I guess if we needed any backup or answers to, or tie-breaking votes, then we'll...
Corrections.
Corrections. So,
Yes.
no pressure on me whatsoever. Anyway, so services for individuals with serious mental illness. What we look for in supportive housing is firstly is being connected with other services in the community, and this is going to vary based on the needs of the individual, but it can range anything from pros, the health care management, health care itself, transportation. Did I say health care management? I meant health home care management. Transportation, certainly clinical services, and working with tenants to have ongoing engagement with their clinic provider is critical. Some of the other things are building and reinforcing good tenancy and independent living skills. Our providers have been reporting to us things like squatters and drug dealing activity happening in supportive housing. Our folks are coming from community residences typically, or some other kind of transitional housing, or even psychiatric centers at times. So they've had ADL training in those environments, but they may need reinforcement of those things, and in order to try to keep them stabilized in permanent supportive housing. And this is where kind of home visits and the benefits of having an on-site presence in a single site supportive housing project is so important, because folks that are on site are able to notice changes in behavior and get into the unit on occasion and communicate what they're seeing to the clinical team and the case manager or care management teams. And lastly, I'll just mention, because I'm trying to speed things up here. Community support teams are sometimes a critical element in maintaining folks who are with SMI in their housing. And those things like ACT or mobile integration teams, MID teams, or even connections with crisis resources as we continue to develop those in the community may be needed to just help maintain individuals in their housing and maintain that housing stability piece.
Yes, I'm last. No pressure.
But not least.
Some may debate that. So today's a really, really important day. Anybody know why? Silence, right? So on this particular day, and those who know me will really appreciate this, on this particular day was the day that the first pitch and first baseball game in America was played. If you don't know why that's important to me, come see me afterwards. But only second to that, this very day in history, is the first kind of assembled team of the ESSHI interagency work group presenting publicly to a public format on all the target populations. So baseball and ESSHI target populations, kind of cool for a rich day in history. So yes, I know I have to talk about our populations, but I also want to know a little bit in the audience.
Who's pitching?
I could look that up, but not at this moment. Just by a show of hands, how many Alex's population are in the audience? Raise your hand. Be proud.
Okay.
All right. AIDS Institute. All right. We have DOH.
Oh, cool. Ooh.
Oasis.
Okay.
OCFS.
A couple? Three?
You're by yourself? Was there only one? Oh, two. Okay. Sorry. Survivors of domestic violence, target populations. All right. OMH. And anybody I didn't call, raise your hand proud. That's us. Right? So from an OTDA perspective, as it relates to ESSHI, we are responsible and primarily are focused on the applications that are serving chronically homeless individuals and families, veterans, as well as the reentry population. OTDA also contracts on behalf of our friends at OCFS and for survivors of domestic violence. We work in conjunction with them in terms of kind of the contract perspective. But the first question is kind of reflecting on the target populations and some of the core services. What's maybe a little bit different from an OTDA lens is I'm going to take a step back and talk about our programs as a whole, because we actually fund and work with every target population up here, right? Whether it's under HHAP or some of our other programs. So for that purpose and for that reason, we don't prescribe a set of services. Moreover, what we're looking for are the services appropriate for the target population. Depending upon the funding streams, the application that presents before us, we may share, and you should know this, we may share your application with our colleagues sitting at the table. Under HHAP, it goes out to make sure that the intended, or the service package meets the expectations surrounding that particular target population. So beyond that, I want to talk about kind of successful programs that we see and what are some of the fundamental kind of key ingredients that we see across that spectrum. And first and foremost, what I think that we see as a key ingredient is trauma-informed case management. So that it's a service package. First, all the service packages are unique and individualized, but I think what's core to all the housing programs that we see is kind of that trauma-informed service package for sure. And I'm trying to go fast, so my apologies. In addition, from an OTDA lens, and I'm going to try to round out some of the conversation so I'm not duplicating everything that everybody was saying, other services that we see in some of our housing programs include job training, education, and one of the big ones that I think was mentioned a little bit earlier was about the living skills or independent living skills. And they kind of take the form and materialize in the form of assisting with budgeting skills, being able to prioritize budgeting, learn how to be a smart shopper, planning for future expenses. Also, under that umbrella that we see is how to navigate your transportation system unique to your community. Assisting residents realizing the importance of maintaining medication also kind of falls under that broad category, as well as some of those classic housekeeping, cooking kind of teachable skills. When I say reunification is a common thread in some of our populations, or service programs, what target population do you think of? Say it loud. Families. Yes, for sure. Also, the young adult population, right, and the youth population. But it's also many of the populations up here, including the one that was just whispered by Brett in my ear, reentry. The reentry population also benefits from a very robust kind of reunification program. Many folks as Henri mentioned, many folks in recovery have burned many bridges, so kind of those reunification activities are meaningful there. Survivors of domestic violence have often isolated themselves, right, from folks to hide maybe the abuse, so reunification activities are valid there. And certainly from the re-entering population. And we many times see that in the form of reestablishing trust, proving that folks coming out can make the right choices as they re-enter. So I'm trying to speed along. And I would be remiss if I didn't talk about kind of the housing management aspect. It's something that's core to all of our programs in terms of what the property is maintained, how it's maintained. You know, ensuring a safe, clean environment that's responsive to the residents' needs, maintaining a close relationship with the service staff. In many instances, the service and the management folks are the eyes, the ears on the ground, and maybe are the first alert system that folks kind of need to be grabbed or figure out what's going on and maybe kind of embraced from a stronger service package at that moment in time, crisis. Also, very important to us is that residents are involved in the decision process. The management of operations, that they have a choice in their own environment and kind of what's happening in their community. So I'll probably stop there, but before I give up the mic, OTDA folks, Dana, Barb, are you still here? If you could stand up. Who else is Karen back there? Scott. These are the folks that make it happen on all of our programs. Scott's with HHAP, Barb's with HHAP, Dana's with HHAP, and Karen's on the services side. So if you haven't had an opportunity to find them and learn more about our programs, I certainly would track them down. And I'm way over, huh?
You're good. Thank you. So, thank you. That was a great sort of overview, I think, to sort of wrap up all of the 11 populations, so I appreciate that. Sort of jumping to the second part of the process, which is when folks actually apply and then receive awards, and then their programs open. Wondering if each of you could spend just a few minutes kind of talking about the responsibilities that providers have with each of the state contracting agencies. So for example, where must referrals come from for your specific populations? What monitoring responsibilities do people have? What reporting requirements? And I'm not sure, does it make sense to start here again and end, or do you want to start here? Let's start, want to start, yeah.
Sure. So I go from batting cleanup to lead off.
Yeah.
My batting average is going well. So I just want to kind of backtrack a little bit from an ESSHI reset in terms of moving from conditional to final award. How many conditional awardees do we have in the audience? Raise your hands, proud. Okay. What's an important message that is generic across all of this is that the conditional awardees, it's incumbent on them to work with the state agency, and the first step that you have to do is demonstrate 100% of the capital financing, right? So once you've secured that, your project then is advanced to the interagency work group. It's vetted through the interagency work group. It's kind of voted on, yes, to accept it, and then from there, OMH Moira sends a final award commitment. That final award commitment letter is your locked-in kind of rate, project and rate. And what's important to know is that in any application, what you applied for in round 1 or round 2, that per unit rate is what you get locked in at. So from an OTDA lens on a referral basis, we look at referrals and kind of the common denominators, homelessness, and of course I'm going to sit up here and say that coordinated entry is kind of our wheelhouse and our expectations from the folks that would be referred into our projects. It's a very broad question, so which kind of moves over to what does monitoring feel like. I'm proud to announce that OTDA has been out monitoring our first ESSHI projects that are up and running, and that's been going well. And some of the things that we look for during our monitoring is the referral source. Is it documented? Are the services consistent with the executed contract? So within a particular contract, it's going to lay out the expectations surrounding services, who you're serving, the target population. So we're kind of validating that when we're out monitoring a particular project. Is confidentiality and kind of residents' rights and protections maintained and observed by the agency? Are the referrals to outside services and agencies and linkages documented in the resident file? Is the housing maintained? Is it safe? Does it look appropriate? Is it someplace where we would want to live and reside? And is there a regular kind of maintenance protocol in the event that there was an emergency or there was a need for a repair? How does that kind of happen? And one of the things from like the case record, again, going back to my previous remarks, what's essential to all of our kind of programs are the documentation of case services. And the next question that's usually asked of me is kind of what does that standard look like? Do you have any kind of written standard? And the standard that we use is kind of a very simple test. It's how I was brought up as a qualified mental retardation professional, QMRP, Alex. That's pretty good, right? I used to work in their population. And that litmus test is this, that does the case record, progress note, whatever term you want to use, if I were that case manager and I were to leave, whether winning the lotto or Moira killing me on the way home, could the service continue without disruption? Right? That's kind of the litmus test that we use, that if services are contingent on one individual's kind of knowledge of the person, then probably from a case record standard, we're going to issue some recommendations surrounding us. So I'll probably leave it there, but that's kind of what we're looking for on the back end, how to move from conditional to final, and then what it feels like when we're out kind of monitoring our contracts.
All right. So for OMH, in terms of kind of requirements or standards, we have supportive housing guidelines that have been in place for a number of years under our scattered site program that we've basically adopted as the standard for ESSHI projects. So those guidelines are out on our website. We are in the process of updating them and to basically specifically fold in ESSHI, but also to address some other issues, and we are currently seeking input from advocacy and membership organizations such as SHINI on those guidelines before we post them. But the 2015 are available on our website. So that's basically our standard. And aside from in those guidelines, aside from the basics of providing a rent subsidy and providing supportive services around housing stability, some other kind of basic principles laid out in the guidelines are that we expect a 90% occupancy rate, at a staffing ratio of between 1 to 20 and 1 to 30. That we expect minimally one contact per month and one home visit in at least every 3 months. And we ask for reporting in our CARES, our Child and Adult Information Reporting System, I think that stands for. So it's our web-based a reporting system, and that's not terribly onerous for supportive housing. It's basically demographics, when folks moved in and out, what their living situation was before, and where they move out to, essentially. That's for kind of a data analysis and tracking for our purposes and for to find individuals. So in terms of referrals, we set a goal for kind of all of our whether it's our capital programs or our operating programs. It was a goal for 50% of OMH units for individuals. I'm saying this specifically because we don't always have 100% SMI units within an ESSHI contract. Obviously, we have multiple populations. So for those folks who are individuals with SMI, we're shooting for 50% to come from our psych center, state-operated or community-operated transitional housing, or our psych center system, for housing like community residences. Unfortunately, those people coming from the psychiatric center system would qualify for the Medicaid redesign team, the MRT 25% requirement, which is new in this RFP, and I'm sure Amanda's going to speak to that. So there will be some overlap there, which hopefully will be beneficial. And lastly, I'll just touch on monitoring. Monitoring will take place at least once within the contract cycle, and more often as necessary. But it would probably look very similar to what Rick is talking about. In fact, in terms of our supportive housing scattered site model, what we tend to do now, we've got a couple of folks here, Kim Benatar and Sheila Simmons from our field office here, who do a lot of that monitoring right now. So that'll look pretty similar to that.
So OTDA is the contracting agency for the domestic violence project. So I think Rick pretty much covered all the contract monitoring issues. In terms of referrals, I would say the only DV projects that have opened thus far, and I think those were from the 2016 funding round, have been upstate. They have been domestic violence programs. So they have been filling their permanent supportive apartments with their own survivors who are coming out of their own shelter. The exception to that are a couple, the two, actually one project that was funded in New York City, and they're getting their referrals from the HRA funded DV programs. So I would expect that that's probably going to be a very typical referral pattern. I think what will change is when some of the projects that are going to be mixed populations that include domestic violence survivors, I would guess that those folks would be referred also from their local shelters and perhaps homeless shelters. I think we won't know until some of them open.
So from OCFS, it's very easy again. We don't do the contracting process, so there's not much to it, but I will just put in a pitch. From a technical assistance standpoint, our staff is always ready to go out and help build any of these programs for youth and young adults. I'm sure if OTTA and their very qualified staff has seen something that they thought is a concern and brought it to OCFS, we would come out and do some technical assistance around program development. I'll just put in a pitch that we do have, we've licensed and certified both our voluntary agencies for young kids who are in foster care, and we also certify our runaway and homeless youth shelters. So we have monitoring tools that would be very applicable for these type programs that are up here if you're doing things for youth and young adults, as well as we have a youth program quality assessment, a YPQA, that New York State Office of Children and Family Services developed, which really does do a good job about the program quality for young people that are in care. So I would just put a pitch in for those few things that would help with the technical assistance aspect of it as opposed to the contracting and monitoring part of it.
The only thing that I would add is some of the projects that we have jointly funded in the past, or whether it's under HHAP or some of our other programs, one of the common practices that I would expect to kind of carry forward is that we've done joint monitoring visits and probably we'll adopt it with Deborah's shop as well when we can. And I think that just enriches the monitoring experience because the monitoring approach that we take is really a resourceful one. Yes, we're out kind of doing the checks and everything we said, but it's an opportunity for us to learn from everybody and all of our community partners, and also an opportunity for you to kind of ask those intimate questions as it relates to your program that maybe you haven't had time to pick up and ask on the phone. So I would imagine that it's going to continue to be that shared experience from a state perspective, but also from when we're out in your projects in the communities. Thanks.
We go? Okay. All right. So from Oasis' perspective, since we are a contracting agency, a couple of years ago when ESSHI, I'm sorry? Oh, thanks. A couple of years ago when ESSHI was just beginning, we saw this as an opportunity because we have ESSHI would make our 8th housing initiative. So what we decided to do is we redid the manual. So we literally took all our initiatives, we looked at ESSHI, and we actually created what we call a how-to housing policy and procedure manual. It's online, accessible to any provider. But it includes, but we didn't want to limit to like staff hiring, staff training, startup needs, such as buying furniture, kitchen supplies. How do you calculate the tenant's rent? How do you deal with service plan development, case managed ratios, eviction issues, things of that nature. So we hope that that would kind of help people at least to get started and resolve a lot of the questions that they might have. The other thing, when you have a conditional ESSHI award in the Oasis arena, we've, starting in round 2, have dedicated pre-development funding. So for those folks with a conditional award, it kind of helps them to jumpstart the project because with documentation and the right forms, we're willing to give you additional funding to just get started and begin your project. In terms of referrals, I think there's a lot of overlap with our referrals, given the ESSHI projects. I believe in New York City, the referrals are probably going to go through the DSS, Coordinated Assessment process that they're developing. I believe it's going to be similar to the HRA 2010E process, like we've been using with the New York 3. In the rest of the state, in a very similar way, they are required, the COCs are required to develop a coordinated process. Some are a little bit ahead of the game, so we are looking for some providers to use those coordinated processes that are already in place. In other instances, they will be tapping into the local DSS, the community agencies that they've been working with, or other network relationships that they have had until a more formal coordinated placement process is in place. With the MRT, I'm understanding we're going to get some assistance from the Department of Health in trying to identify some of the referrals with some of the particulars that they're looking at. Monitoring, I just have this belief, what you don't monitor doesn't happen. And so, so post the RFP awards, we certainly want to begin monitoring as soon as possible. And monitoring can simply look like conference calls. Let's talk about the board. What are you thinking? What do you need? What are your startup thoughts? So basically, post the RFP, we want to do the startup, which would be we get your first quarter funding. Around the 5th, 4th month, we want to do what we call technical assistance. Come out and actually talk to you in more detail about your project, your startup, because we are looking at the 6-month point of you being fully utilized, and as my partner Brett said, oh wow, about 90% utilization at that point, which we hope you will maintain or at least do better. We do annual site visits, and we use those to really assess, is the provider following the RFP in its intention? Are you having the documentation that's necessary? Are you utilizing or following the manual that we developed, which is prescriptive to how the program should be run and function? Site visits always, end up with a findings, document. Again, what you don't document doesn't happen. So we have findings, we do corrective action plans if necessary. If there's a need for additional technical assistance, I think we're more willing to be proactive and help you than to solve a problem after the fact. So, we really encourage, be open, ask questions, tell us what you're struggling with, We'd rather address things early on than try to solve problems that have become more and more of a problem, put it that way. We also expect annual in-person provider meetings. This is our opportunity to literally see the providers face to face, talk about what's going on over the year. Let's see. We do, I mentioned this a little bit, conference calling, and we found that was really effective 3 years ago when we implemented the MRT program. Those month-to-month conference calls really help to get that rolling, and we're finding the same thing is true with our ESSHI. Doing these frequent conference calls amongst the providers who have conditional awards. Lastly, you don't have the clock on me. Okay, so lastly, all right, so reporting. Of course, we require monthly reports from all our providers, which includes tracking of admissions, discharge. We collect demographic information. With our MRT programs, we're looking at things more specifically, like length of stay, referral source, end of your housing reasons, things like that nature. I'll stop. Okay, thank you.
All right, everybody. Okay, so the Human Resources Association is really used to working with the MRT designation
and automatically works with the Department of Homeless Services to help prioritize the individuals for the projects. Referrals can also come from managed care organizations, managed long-term care plans, homeless shelters, hospitals, performing provider systems, skilled nursing facilities, institutional settings, health homes, and of course EHS. Something to keep in mind is MRT requirements really align very closely with HRA. A suggestion that we have before applying is really look at the potential funding sources and see how they align close next to each other. Just, of course, as you know, just as the provider, you are responsible for ensuring that each of the funding sources requirements are met. For DOH, we have quarterly reporting for all active and executed contracts. Some of the reports that we do, actually this is all of the reports that we do, we have a narrative report, which is a basic Word document explaining what has gone on over the last quarter. We have the budget statement and report of expenditures, which is just a spreadsheet that you'll include with all of receipts and documentation supporting the purchase that have gone on over the course of the quarter. And then of course we have the Medicaid data warehouse spreadsheet. This is really a very basic spreadsheet that requires the individuals within the project's Medicaid identification numbers. Once the project is fully rented up, we have decided that the spreadsheet can be sent quarterly to me or as changes occur. You know, something to remember is you are not breaking or violating HIPAA by filling out the Medicaid data warehouse, as some of you may have questions regarding that, especially if it's new to you. As potential tenants will be aware of the requirements of the units, you are providing information directly to the Medicaid office, and the Department of Health will also be providing you how to safely send the information password protected. This is truly how we track cost savings and overall health outcomes of the individuals and the success of your programs. Thank you.
Made my job easy because since the AIDS Institute is also part of the health department, we pretty much have the same referral process. New York City, of course, a lot of the referrals will come from HASA. But we find that, at least with our current housing programs, that a lot of referrals are just in-house. The person's already receiving services at that agency, and housing always comes up as an issue, so there's a lot of in-house from health home care managers. So really the same what that Amanda was speaking to. Monitoring. AIDS Institute loves to monitor. So we are required to go out once every 2 years, but we go out much more frequently than that. We do a lot of follow-up, and we have a whole fiscal unit that does a very robust fiscal monitoring. If you're familiar with Ryan White funds, if you receive any Ryan White money from the AIDS Institute, the fiscal monitoring has to be on site. It's a HRSA requirement. If you do not have any Ryan White funding from the AIDS Institute, so I'm not talking about Part A, I'm talking about Part B. If you have just straight state funding, which includes ESSHI, the fiscal monitoring most often would be a desk review. And it's pretty intense because we have had a lot of involvement with the state controller's office. So that's the fiscal end of it. The program monitoring, like I said, we are required to go out once every 2 years. We typically go out annually. We have a whole monitoring tool. The majority of our visit is client record review. We do some administrative discussion with personnel records. We look at staff that we're funding. We look at their records. And we do some quality assurance reviews. For reporting requirements, if anyone has AIDS Institute funding, I'm sure you're familiar with AIRS. It's a loved system. And it is client-level demographic information that is, it is very important for us reporting to HRSA and for being able to demonstrate that our programs are virally suppressing individuals. So it is a requirement that you use the AIR system. You cannot use a different system. We also have monthly narrative reporting requirements. Sounds similar to what State Health Department does on a quarterly basis. Ours are monthly, and we also do the same voucher process but we don't require backup. On a monthly basis, we do not require backup, but we can request it. We would for a fiscal audit. And I think that's it for us.
Okay, Okay, so for agencies that are serving people with intellectual and developmental disabilities through their ESSHI award, OPWDD does have its own internal capital program for supportive housing. We are allotted $15 million for a state fiscal year, which we try to divide up between both of HCR's funding streams, both the 4% and 9% tax credit program, and HPD programs as well. If your agency or developer is applying for funding through HCR, whether it's in the open window or unified funding, and you have units for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, you must have a support letter and a capital commitment from OPWDD for HCR to move your project forward. Without one, it's possible they could just push it to the side. With our own application process, we try to align the submission dates with the unified funding, with our application being due in the fall and open window during sometime in the summer. We ask for basic information about the project, the development site, developer's history and experience, particularly with supportive housing projects, as well as the agency's experience for providing services to people with IDD within the community, whether it's providing referrals or transferring a rental subsidy and ensuring that people maintain housing sustainability. We conduct due diligence checks on the back end of the agencies, whether it's checking if they have any infractions with our Division of Quality Improvement and Performance Metrics. It's called the Early Alert Lists. We're checking with our Office of Audit Services, consolidated fiscal reporting, and things of all that sort to ensure we're providing funds to good, strong providers that will be around for a while. Let's see. The main responsibilities of the provider on site will be providing the housing-related supports. We ask them to work with our regional office to provide any referrals for during rent-up and as vacancies become available. We ask them to make sure that the rental subsidy gets from the original destination to the property manager each month on a timely basis, and to ensure that people are paying their portion of the rent, whether it's 30% or more. As well as addressing any tenancy issues people may have within their supported housing unit. For instance, if they're having difficulties with a neighbor but are unsure about going to a property manager directly, just having a support staff on hand that they can try to ameliorate the issue with in-house beforehand before bringing it to the landlord or property manager. We also ask that people's tenancy cannot be tied to any waiver-related supports. So if a person elects to choose a different service provider to receive any waiver supports or to self-direct their services through OPWDD's self-direction program, that cannot lead to any eviction or anything like that. The housing must stay separate from the supports. And at the moment, we don't have any firm reporting requirements for ESSHI. Our first project just closed on construction financing a few months ago, so we're expecting it to be operational within the next year or so. I would imagine they would include things such as keeping a list on hand of people that are currently residing there, including their Medicaid ID numbers in case we wanted to track any savings that people accrue while they stay there. Thank you.
Can I ask the first round of questions? Before we get to your questions.
I have many questions to ask here.
Pop quiz. What's the ESSHI due date? What time? Pass. HHAP due date for those interested in capital development. Say that again, loud. Correct. What time? So what's that? 9 a.m. Yes. Open for business and accepting. And last question that I have: what year was the first baseball game played?
1846.
Good try. Not this date in history that I saw. Yes, Dana? That is correct.
That's a staff. Look it up.
All right, moving along. So Amanda, you spoke earlier to the changes in MRT for the ESSHI program. Just wondering if you could spend a few minutes talking a little bit more detail about what's changed this year.
Absolutely.
And then I have a follow-up question from the audience about that change too that I may go to if you don't.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so this year, the eligibility definition provides much more flexibility in identifying a high utilizer. The person, as I talked about before, needs to be both homeless and meet the definition of individuals. They need to be enrolled in Medicaid or have used Medicaid in the last 12 months and meet at least one of the items in our menu to choose from. So, enrolled in a health home, state hospital, skilled nursing facility, health and recovery plan, special needs plan. And you can also qualify as a high Medicaid utilizer, as I said, by the number of emergency visits. So they get really specific, and it is located in the RFP, but 2 or more inpatient stays, 5 or more emergency department visits, or 4 or more emergency department visits and 1 or more inpatient stay. And then you could also qualify by being within the top 20% of Medicaid recipients, spending relative to the county of fiscal responsibility and target population parameters. And now the big thing, we had established a 25% rule. So with this, projects of 15 or more ESSHI qualifying individuals units with 30 or more dwelling units in total, serving the applicable populations will be required to set aside 25% of designated ESSHI units for high-cost, high-need Medicaid users. So now the applicable populations are your traditional MRT population, so SMI, SUD, HIV/AIDS, chronic homelessness, frail elderly, and IDD. Now we did this for a few reasons, and I'll go through those. So MRT, isn't a population in itself. This allows us to have a balance in projects to make sure we are having a percentage that does cater to the high Medicaid user vulnerable population that would otherwise not be served. There is also a specific set aside through the Supportive Housing Opportunity Program. By overlaying that money, you are allowing the developers to also have that access to that additional funding. Currently, we are involved in a 3-year evaluation that shows with the designation there is recognized Medicaid savings and increased overall health benefits to the population being served. This is a mandatory designation. This allows for cross-disability projects and flexibility in identifying eligible individuals. We have had multiple providers that have stated that flexibility within the prioritization menu allows for the identification of eligible individuals to be easier than before, and we wanted to make that available. As I also mentioned, there is an added benefit. So with that additional funding available through the Supportive Housing Opportunity Program. So those are, I don't want to say that's it, but those are the big changes for the Department of Health.
And is the 25%, is that retroactive to the old ESSHI 1 and 2, if you would? Or is it just starting now for this year, going forward?
Yeah. So for round 1, year 1, there was nothing in that RFP specific to the MRT criteria, but if you had a commitment for MRT capital in your project, then it would be for the 25%. For year 2, now HCR did have the ability to put in the requirements of their contract, MRT expectations, so that non-for-profit agencies would be expected through the HCR contract and with the oversight of their state contracting agency to have that 25% MRT eligible residents. And then year 3, if your agency is part of the Medicaid population agencies, then you would be expected to have that 25%.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Rick, Olmsted, could you speak a little bit to sort of what is the thinking around Olmsted? Can you talk about how the neighborhood size might impact it, client choice, kind of what folks should be thinking around this particular topic?
I chuckle a little bit because Moira used to call me Rick Olmsted.
Accidentally.
And I'm not so certain how that kind of happened. So I'm going to talk a little bit from an OTDA, and then I'm actually going to defer to my state colleagues here because homelessness, chronic homelessness from an OTDA lens is a life challenge, right? So we support in all of our programs, ESSHI and that sort of stuff, the Olmsted for sure. And from an OTDA lens, some of the things that we consider with community integration integration is the community as a whole, and not just a project site or a designation of units. We want to make sure our projects are within a community, they're not on an island, they have access to the necessary services. And that's really our approach to our projects. to the extent that we support all the populations here that have a very specific definition and requirement based on the disability, we would support it in our capital programs, our ESSHI programs, and I'm probably going to punt a little bit to further talk about that, and I'll start with OMH.
Nicely played. So I'll try to give you kind of an overview. So we specifically addressed Olmsted for the first time with this third round RFP, and that was basically to indicate that in mixed use, affordable, and supportive housing projects, we generally are looking for a maximum of 50% of populations that would fall under the American with Disabilities Act. Those are, and forgive me if I'm missing someone, but it's folks with serious mental illness, intellectual and developmental disabilities, substance abuse disorder, HIV/AIDS. Is that it? Okay. We would accept that kind of 50% as a rule of thumb, and 60% in New York City around those type of projects due to the density. But that's not necessarily I guess a hard and fast rule. Not so much the 50%, but smaller projects in some cases. And I'll let Oasis and OPW speak to their specific rules around this, but we see some, in some cases, smaller kind of upstate projects or rural projects or projects that are kind of integrated in the community where you have a single house with a very small number of units. We've had folks come to us with a 3-unit project in Rensselaer, a project in mind. It's somewhat of a judgment call, but we would not assume that simply because it's 100% supportive housing units in a small community integrated project that it would be violative of Homestead. So I'll pass it along to Oasis and
Correct me if I'm wrong, kind of that on the smaller project scale, it's kind of that, back to what you were saying, it's not a hard pass, but it's kind of that test of, does it feel institutional or not, right? Is it, you know, is the project kind of have a residential feel as if it was, you know, your neighboring? And I think that's, on the smaller projects scale, that's something that I think you would consider, or smaller state agency colleagues would consider.
Well, we didn't want to think of integration in terms of size, you know, and like, oh, sorry, okay. So integration had to do with size, although we did recognize in the out of New York City area, like Brett's saying, you know, some of our smaller projects would be burdensome to try to force this. We knew it would almost take care of itself in downstate, so we gave some flexibility, and that's one of the things we really appreciate about ESSHI and this work group. We were able to discuss and look at what makes sense, you know, in terms of some of our different populations. So with Olmsted, out of New York City, when you're doing a smaller project, we've allowed you the flexibility of not being tied to the Olmsted, you know, rule.
So our supportive housing requirements are, in terms of percentages of allowable units, are a bit lower than everybody else's. We allow up to 25% of the units within a project to be set aside for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and 30% if you're adding another special population within the project. The reason for this is our agency is very beholden to the home and community-based settings regulations. So there cannot be any isolating factors. The units must be integrated throughout the project. They can't be set aside in one building or one wing. They must look no different than any other apartment within the projects. For example, they can't be apartments that just resemble dorm rooms, essentially, that have a shared kitchen or bathrooms on the floor. For the people that were receiving the supportive housing units, they must resemble any other 1 or 2 bedroom unit within the apartment project.
I would just like to add one thing to that, and that's just that we also have access to the governor's special counsel on Olmsted, and whenever there's a question, instead of making the assumption that we would know, we certainly access Roger Bearden, who is the special counsel, for advice, so we're moving forward. So if you have a question about that, please contact whatever agency you're working with, so we can then follow through and make sure we're accurate. We don't want anybody to be hung up in the future based on a decision that was questionable.
Do all ESSHI programs have to be housing first?
Ours do.
Ours
Ours are. That's the model. That's the model of the Institute follows.
I think, I think it depends on the population, and I'm not going to speak for necessarily for the ESSHI group, but I'm going to rephrase or restate your question. Do they all have to? There's no requirement that I'm aware of in any sort of writing that mandates a housing first model. That being said, I think it's based on target population. It's the supported approach. It's a proven approach. But certainly, I wouldn't want to walk away from here saying that it's mandated by ESSHI. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Well, in addition, I think, given the different agencies and the contracting agency, there are nuances. So, each agency has different nuances. So, what might be true for Oasis is not true for OMH or the AIDS Institute. So, we really encourage you, get in touch with the agency you're going to be working with, read the RFP, so you're kind of clear with what is expected given who I'm contracting with and the population I'm going to be housing.
For OPWDD, for that population who are homeless in shelter, how do folks find them, prioritize them, serve them through ESSHI?
We, traditionally, OPWDD has not been in the continuum of care or any of the New York agreements. So people with IDD haven't been tracked historically through a lot of the data systems that have been utilized for the other populations. We rely on our regional offices a lot to field calls from the shelters who believe they may have someone who qualifies for our services there that is in need of housing right away. In that case, we would work to find them a suitable solution as quickly as possible. And if they don't qualify under one of OPWDD's target populations through ESSHI, if they are qualified street homeless, then they would still be under the target population.
Thank you. And for the frail elderly population, we have a question here. If folks are planning to serve this population in the ESSHI units, can they also serve low-income seniors in the affordable units?
They can.
Or is that something that you've seen?
The current projects that we have gotten thus far within round 1 and round 2, it's really been separate. They can serve both, but there really would be no reason to not, include those within the ESSHI units. You know what I mean? Like actually have it be, have the combined populations within all of the ESSHI units that are going to be a part of the project.
And then doing straight low income.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. For OMH, any thought to creating more licensed housing when we talk about the continuum? Clearly this would not be, I think, through ESSHI, but is there any thought to doing, through your portfolio lens, any thought to doing more, offering more licensed housing options in the future?
At this point, feel free to jump in more. I really there's no plans at this point to develop additional licensed housing. I think it's we're moving into more integrated models. Although that doesn't mean that there's anything to undermine the existing system that we have. It's important. It serves a vital purpose, but in terms of expanding those other models, there's not much in the pipeline that I'm aware of, unless one wants to speak to that.
And if I could, I will. What we do want to you know I love to talk. Two things. One, we really want to take a look at our existing housing stock, our community residences, 24-hour programs, and are they being utilized the best they can be in moving individuals through. Thank you very much. Is it on? Okay. Moving individuals through to the supported housing or to a lower level or higher level, whatever you want to, whichever way you look at it, of care, level of independence. So that's one thing we're looking at, because really those units in the 24-hour supervised programs, whether they be CRs or CRSROs, have the intensity that some people really need coming out of psychiatric centers and coming out of prison settings and coming from even shelters at times. So that's really important that we look at what we have and are we doing it as best we can. We are actually also looking at, and this is preliminary, that's why really Brett hasn't spoke about it, but we are looking at, is there a need for more apartment treatment, which is a congregate care level, or it's not congregate care, it's a level 2 facility. So it does have Medicaid and it's scattered site, and it does have more intensive staffing. Again, we're taking a look at that. We're also still engaging in conversation about housing redesign. If someone wants to close a community residence and move that into apartment treatment in the communities, we would certainly be available to do that. As you may know, the Office of Mental Health is also in the process of putting together a pretty robust crisis system in the state that has really 3 phases to it. One is a mobile component, but the second is a residential component. And that residential component, there'll be 3 different levels of crisis residences. The first one being more of a peer focus, the second more of a medical model, and the third being one to serve children. So that will be another really congregate setting for individuals to help them maintain in the community.
This is a dual diagnosis question. I think for Brett and Henri both. If a provider is OMH housing, but the folks are showing sort of signs that there's substance abuse issues with the tenant, is OMH work with Oasis on implementing policies to address the substance abuse challenges, or what is the relationship, I guess, with the 2 agencies, if any?
That's a tough one too.
Yeah.
These are tough questions, you people. So I think the relationship is very close. I mean, you can see that not only this panel, but we work on things with Oasis like integrated licensing. Medicated assisted treatment is something that we're seeing growing, and we're certainly recognizing the supportive housing population that co-occurring disorders are prevalent and maybe even on the rise. So I'm not sure what the question's really getting at in terms of an ESSHI focus. I thought you were going to ask which agency would it be assigned to, which I would say pick one, I guess. Right?
I think if someone has been assigned to OMH, right, but then they're showing substance abuse, signs of substance abuse, what types of services, substance abuse services or policies would be in place, I guess, to address that? That's what they're trying to ask.
Go right ahead.
So, is the mic on? So one of the things we did when we started this ESSHI process, looking at mixed populations, meaning you as a proposer could say, I want a little piece of this, a little piece of that. So we're very good friends. We meet every week. I mean, I know these folks, and so if we're going out the gate, the provider is looking to do SUD and OMH, we're already collaborating. We're already talking about, all right, what kind of services is that provider planning, given the mixed populations or the 2 populations that we are, overseeing. On my side, if a question came up, Brett's phone number is kind of right on my wall in my head, or vice versa. So we collaborate and really look at these as opportunities to address, those things that we don't work with specifically, but we do in partnership. Does that answer your question?
I think so, yeah. And we have, I think, 2 minutes left, so we'll go for one more question. And if we didn't get to your question, please, I guess I could offer the fact that the panelists will be up here for a few minutes after. Please feel free to come up and make sure to get your questions answered. But overall, on an evaluation side, is there any plans for an evaluation on ESSHI? What are you thinking from a policy standpoint? Have you started talking about it? Is it too early?
I think it, you can round me out. I think it depends on how you define evaluation, right? And that's kind of the hesitancy. I think every year we do a couple different things to assist us with feedback and evaluation, and it also depends on what part of ESSHI that you're talking about. So I'll talk about things that we've done and maybe some future work. So I think every year as rounds close, we kind of reflect back on the process as a whole and kind of some successes and maybe some obstacles encountered or hurdles that we had to work through, both on the administration side, the collaboration side, and just even from kind of like a project management side. I also think some of the things that we've done as a work group, and Moira kind of spearleading us, is we've gone around the state much with your help, and we've opened that open and honest feedback when the RFP has been closed, to take back considerations, maybe policies, maybe ways that we've rolled out the supportive housing initiative, and we self-reflect and see what barriers we can remove. So we certainly are mindful of that from an administration perspective. As projects become operational, your question too kind of looked at the monitoring practices, right? All the state agencies have an expectation of some kind of quarterly reporting and looking at the people served and kind of the successes and the programs that are being funded under ESSHI. So we're mindful of that. The quarterly report on the actual service and the people being served is something that we plan on being able to evaluate and reflect on in out years once the projects are there's a rich project. In terms of I think how many of you were here in the opening, the commissioners panel and that sort of stuff. I think one of the things that was stated during that time in terms of the target populations and the units that have advanced to final award, I think that's a year-by-year reflection to see on where we are and the types of projects that have been funded on an annual basis. So I say yes to evaluation.
I think a little league biggie, right? What do you mean by evaluation? This is the governor's housing plan. We meet with the governor's staff on a monthly basis, and if he would like us to do a larger evaluation, the biggie evaluation, that's something that we would be prepared to do if that is something that's wanted, needed. We have not discussed that, however. But we do daily evaluation of our work, is what you're saying here. But there's not been a directive set, we're going to do an overall evaluation.
Like there was with the MRT
right.
program.
But right now, remember, we're only halfway through year 2. So, I think this conversation may be at the end of the 5 years with the 6,000. It's going to be a different ending to the story.
And then I just want to say, from an OCFS perspective, although we're not a contracting agency,
Right.
we have seen a success
Absolutely.
from our partnership at this level, where youth and young adults were not a topic, were not really discussed. We now saw his hands went up 3.
Right.
So the little E evaluation from ours is next year maybe it's 6. Rick and I have done some sideshows because of the relationship here with this partnership that has been successful to agencies who have providing services for youth and young adult services. So the little E evaluation is occurring as we're already talking, and we've had great successes.
Absolutely. I will say it really, bringing these 9 agencies together has been very powerful. in the work that you've done. But thank you for bringing us here today.
I'll just also kind of add that to all the experts in the room that are sitting on this side, you guys have absolutely already memorialized and documented that supportive housing is a cost-effective approach, right? So that premise is understood and already memorialized.
Yeah, well, hopefully next year we'll have you all back and we can showcase some of the projects that have been funded and opened and continue the conversation. So thank you all very much.